If you would turn off your phones,
That's good.
so that we don't have a little interruption during the course of this. I'm Lenore Perlman, president of the Friends of the Claremont Library, which has sponsored this On the Same Page community read for 12 years now. This is our 12th year. Yeah. Excellent. So if you've seen, if you live in town, you've probably seen lawn signs for most of those years as they are sprinkled about. This year, we add our thanks to Pitzer College, which has provided this lovely theater, as well as the Office of Advancement, and especially to Linda Lamb and her team from the Center for Asian Pacific American Students, and for all their aid and comfort. And you are comfortable there because of them. Let's give them a hand. Okay, just to get an idea about our audience today, if you are a member of the Friends of the Claremont Library, would you raise your hand? Yes. Okay. If you're not and want to become one, out in the lobby will be these envelopes. You can take them or you can fill them and give them to us, but we'd love you to become members. If you are in a book club, which is one of more than 30 book clubs in our community, please raise your hand. Yes. Okay, we have discovered that book clubs have provided our most constant readers from year to year. If you are a student, faculty, or staff at the Claremont colleges, would you please raise your hand? All right. I know that some of you are reading The Sympathizer as we speak, so welcome. And welcome to all who are here. And just a couple of announcements as you saw as you walked in. Please, no food or drink in the theater. Refreshments will be provided in the foyer at the conclusion of the program. This event is being recorded and will be available to view. Books by our speakers are provided by the Huntley Bookstore and will be for sale in the lobby for book signing after the program. The final event from On the Same Page will take place at the Claremont Library in the meeting room 2 weeks from today, March 16th at 2 o'clock. It will be a celebration of new refugees in our community, featuring Claremont City Council member Jed Liano, who is an immigration attorney, who's going to comment on the state of refugee relocation here in California. We will also share stories, some marvelous food, including, I understand, baklava. Okay. And make some new friends, and you are all invited to attend. And to conclude, I would like to point out a recent example of the national importance of Professor Nguyen, and this is the cover of the double issue of Time magazine published last November with his article headlined on the cover, "Who Gets to Be American?" Who indeed? Now I'd like to invite Rose Ash, longtime On the Same Page committee member, to introduce our speakers. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Lenore. It is my pleasure to introduce our guests today. I would like to begin by introducing the distinguished professor and Pulitzer Prize-winning author Viet Thanh Nguyen. Professor Nguyen was born in Vietnam and raised in America. He presently holds the Errol Arnold Chair of English at the University of Southern California, where he teaches English, American Studies and Ethnicity, and comparative literature. As a literary scholar and writer of fiction, he has crafted a nuanced portrait of the Vietnam War. His novel, The Sympathizer, is a New York Times bestseller and won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. Other honors include the Dayton Literary Peace Prize and the Edgar Award for Best First Novel from the Mystery Writers of America, among others. Among his other books is Nothing Ever Dies, Vietnam and the Memory of War, a finalist for the National Book Award in Nonfiction. Most recently, he has been the recipient of fellowships from the Guggenheim and the MacArthur Foundations. In conversation with Mr. Nguyen today is acclaimed Claremont author Mai Elliott. Ms. Elliott was born in Vietnam and grew up in Hanoi and Saigon. She and her family were displaced by war in Vietnam 3 times, and her family became refugees for the 4th time when they fled Saigon in April 1975. Ms. Elliott is the author of The Sacred Willow, 4 Generations in the Life of a Vietnamese Family, a personal and family memoir which was nominated for the Pulitzer Prize. Her second notable book, Rand in Southeast Asia, A History of the Vietnam War Era, chronicles the think tank's involvement in research about the Vietnam War at the behest of policymakers in Washington and the impact of its involvement on Rand itself. You may recognize Ms. Elliott as having been featured in 7 of the 10 episodes PBS Ken Burns documentary film series, The Vietnam War. She has also served as an advisor to the filmmaker on the series. Please give a warm welcome to Viet and Mai.
Well, thank you so much to the Claremont Public Library for inviting me, for selecting the refugees, and thanks to all of you for braving the weather and coming out here. It's such a pleasure to be here in Claremont for the first time speaking, actually, and really just an honor to be here with Mai Elliott, whose work I've known actually for a very long time. Your work with the RAND Corporation. I think I read some of the studies when I was a student many years ago, and it was always in the back of my mind when I was writing The Sympathizer. It was actually a plot idea that I had about the RAND Corporation.
Oh, really?
Yeah, about.
Good.
I thought, well, my narrator, the spy, when he comes to the United States, Southern California, in the 70s, he had to get a job. So I thought maybe he should get a job with the RAND Corporation or something like it. And it didn't work out, But I was hoping to have a chance to satirize RAND Corporation. It just didn't happen. But anyway, I really love The Sacred Willow. Really recommend it in case you haven't had a chance to read it yet. And now you have the opportunity here with Mai Elliott to have a conversation with her as well about this marvelous book. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for being here, and it's a real pleasure to meet you and converse with you today. I also like to add to my gratitude to the library and the organizing committee for holding this event today, and for you all to come, like Viet said, even though it's pouring rain out there. So anyway, since we only have about 45 minutes to talk about the subject of refugees, especially Vietnamese refugees, let me just plunge into this. Shall I just give a brief history of the movement of Vietnamese refugees? So what happened was in 1975, in April of 1975, when South Vietnam fell suddenly, the United States evacuated a total of 130,000 people whom they deemed as vulnerable to communist reprisals. And 7,000 of them were airlifted out in the last 18 hours of the war by helicopter, in the biggest airlift by helicopter in history. So anyway, after that, the economy of South Vietnam collapsed due to the U.S. embargo, due to misguided policies by the communist government, and the legacy of war. Also, communist repression became intensified. So that drove a lot of people to flee, and they became known as boat people. And they would flee in rickety boats that were not seaworthy at all, overcrowded. They became prey to sea pirates from Thailand. In one of the stories, you talk about that. And then their boats capsized in the storm and so on. The UN High Commissioner of Refugees estimated that somewhere between 200,000 to 400,000 refugees died at sea. Nobody knows the exact figure. Thousands of them became prey to Thai pirate attacks. Sometimes these pirates would attack 3 times a day against the same boat. And the pirates would rob the refugees, kill them, sank their boats, raped and abducted the women and girls. So with that as a background, we'll talk about the refugees. So by definition, a refugee is somebody who's gone through trauma. I remember reading that your family fled when you were 4 years old. So when the communists first carried out their final offensive in South Vietnam, they attacked a town called Ban Me Tuot in the central highlands in the middle of the country, the mountain region, and that's when your family fled. Do you remember anything, or did you understand what was going on?
Well, I don't remember anything. I think my memories really begin as memories, as a whole story, once I came here to the United States as a refugee. And so I just have images before March or April 1975, and I have no idea if they're even real or whether they're just part of my imagination. But yes, my family had a very dramatic refugee escape story, as just about everybody had one of the Vietnamese American, Vietnamese refugee community. And sort of like your family, my parents were refugees more than once. They weren't refugees 4 times, but they were refugees twice. In 1954, when the country was divided into North and South, and my parents fled from the North to the South, and then again in 1975. And you know, it was of course an experience that was deeply traumatic for my parents, and to that extent was traumatic for me too, because their trauma was passed on to me, and I grew up in a Vietnamese refugee community in San Jose, California, surrounded by Vietnamese refugees, all of whom had gone through some kind of horrible experience to get to this country. And so actually, I think for all of us, it was normal. We didn't know anybody who didn't have a terrible experience. And so that just became a part of the fabric of life. It didn't mean it wasn't difficult. It just meant that we normalized these kinds of experiences, and everybody coped with them a little bit differently. And in my case, you know, my memories began in a refugee camp in Fort Indian Town Gap in Pennsylvania. So these 130,000 people who came to this country were put into one of 4 refugee camps, and that was ours. And that's when my memories began, being taken away from my parents. Because in order to leave one of these camps, you had to have a sponsor, an American sponsor, to take you. And typically they would take the entire family. But for whatever reason, I don't understand, to this day I don't understand what happened, no sponsor would take my entire family. So one sponsor took my parents, one sponsor took my 10-year-old brother, and one sponsor took 4-year-old me. That's what I remember. That's the beginning of memory for me. And of course it was a traumatic experience when you're 4 years old to be taken away from your parents, and it was being done benevolently, because the idea was to help my parents get on their feet again. But when you're 4 years old, you don't experience it that way. So I remember howling and screaming being taken away from my parents. And you know, I have a son, and you know, when he turned 4 about a year and a half ago, it made me relive that entire experience, seeing it through his eyes and realizing that it was not just horribly painful for me, but horribly painful for my parents as well. And you know, that separation was only for a few months, but for a 4-year-old, it felt like forever. And that for me was what being a refugee meant.
Yeah, for me too. When the first time it happened, I was too little. I didn't even know that it had happened. The second time, certain very vivid images stayed in my brain, but I didn't understand them, you know, what was really going on. But later on, as I got older, I began to hear more, see more, understand a little more. So I'm not surprised that, you know, you felt the trauma, but you didn't go through it.
Do you think that shaped your life, those experiences of being a refugee?
Yes, it was difficult because suddenly the ground was cut from under you, and my family had to start over again and over again, over again. But on the other hand, it made you stronger, and my attitude is, if nobody's shooting at me, I'm okay. So my first question, it has to do with the memory of the trauma that we talk about. In your first story, which I thought was very well written, really moving, It's a story of a woman, a ghostwriter, who's still haunted by the ghost of her brother, who protected her from being raped by Thai pirates. But she kept seeing his ghost, and the mother too, kept seeing the ghost. Can you discuss this traumatic experience? Did you meet other refugees who went through this experience of, having been victims of Thai pirates?
Well, I think that, yes. I mean, most of the people I knew came in two waves. Either they were a part of this wave of April 30th, 1975, and they happened to be part of the elite for most of them, the military, political elite. And my family was a part of that, except we just got lucky. We were not a part of any elite, okay? We just happened to get lucky and get on a boat and get out of Saigon. But the other portion of the refugee population that I knew of went through these boat experiences, and I never asked them what they went through. Why would I ask them? It's like, I know that they went through something horrible because I had done the research, like, as you did, and knew these stories, I knew these statistics, and so I didn't want to inquire. And that was part of what it meant to grow up in a refugee community, to know that there were all these traumatic experiences that were happening, and sometimes people would talk about them, and sometimes they wouldn't, but I would never want to ask, because who knows how horrible those things might have been and why rewake them. But I also grew up with this knowledge that ghosts were real in Vietnamese society.
Yes.
I mean, their ghosts were real even before we became refugees. They're part of Vietnamese lore, and we believe that the dead come back and visit us. And in that sense, ghosts are not necessarily bad. Ghosts can be benevolent visitations. And so I wanted to explore both these dimensions of the ghost as benevolent visitor, but also the ghost as a sign of haunting by the past. And it seemed to me in this Vietnamese refugee community that we were haunted by the past. Yes. Whether or not there were really ghosts, there were figurative ghosts that were just as powerful. And to me, it seemed like so many people had not gotten over the past, would never get over the past, and the ghost was a figure for that. So I wanted to write a short story where that was simply a part of the narrative. And it was a very difficult story to write. I think just as it is difficult to live with ghosts or to be traumatized for a writer to deal with the past can also be very difficult. So that opening story, Black-Eyed Women, which you'll read take you about 20 or 30 minutes, it took me 50 drafts over 17 years to write that story. It was the first story I started writing, it was the last story I finished writing. And I think it was partly because it's just really difficult to write short stories, but also it's really difficult to address these ghosts of the past. As a writer, my challenge was, how do you represent a ghost? How do you make the ghost move and talk? And so it was just very, very challenging to try to imagine how this ghost would appear in someone's life.
Yeah. So in order to move on after a refugee came to America, for example, and resettle, a refugee has to forget the past because a refugee doesn't want the past to hold him or her back. When I was doing a promotion tour with Ken Burns for his documentary, I did about 10 of his tours. And we showed once the clips to a Vietnamese American audience. And at the end, some young people came up to me and said, my parents never talk about what happened to them in Vietnam. I don't really understand them because I don't really know what they went through. Maybe this film would open doors and we can talk about it. So it's not that the parents have forgotten, they just have to move on.
I think that's true. It's so individual, I mean, there are so many people I've met who are like that, where they don't talk about the past, either the parents or the children, and it's compounded by language. That the children who are raised here, many of them don't speak Vietnamese, or the Vietnamese they speak is very limited. So, for example, when I grew up, the only things I spoke about with my parents were religion, food, and education. That was it. Okay, so how am I supposed to talk to them about these horrible things that might have happened? So I had to wait for the stories, and some of my parents, would tell me some of these stories, and they were all bad. They were all bad. So I just associated Vietnam with trauma.
Yes.
And we hope that stories like the Burns documentary or this fiction or your book would open these kinds of doors. But I don't know. I'm not sure that that's always the case. Sometimes it does happen, sometimes it doesn't. The people who've lived through this traumatic experience of the past, some have gotten over it, but many have not. And I'm not even sure what to get over the past means. You know, I think a lot of Vietnamese Americans of that generation, some of them have succeeded here in this country. They have all the trappings of material wealth and they've become model minorities and all that, but many of them have not. You know, there's a tremendous amount of poverty and alcoholism and abuse and all these kinds of things that happen in the Vietnamese community that we don't talk about in public,
Yes.
but totally exist. I mean, I saw all this when I was growing up in San Jose. And so I don't know that they've gotten over the past. I think collectively we put on the face to the public, at least to the rest of the United States, that we've moved on and we become citizens and we become a part of this country. But I look inside the community, I look inside families, I don't see that happening all the time. And, you know, if you, not far from here in Orange County in Little Saigon, they haven't gotten over the past. They've made it a public display, you know, of hanging on to a particular notion of South Vietnam, which is a traumatic notion of South Vietnam. It's a proud notion of a militarized South Vietnam, but it's one that's defined completely by the fact that they're still locked into the trauma of losing their country.
Yeah.
And so it's very difficult to think that the community or large portions of the community have actually gotten over the past at all.
Yes. That's what leads me to the next question, is the complexity of the Vietnamese refugee community. There's class divisions, there's wealth division. You addressed that in one of your stories about the woman who was going around collecting money, practically extorting money from business owners to finance a fantasy of taking back South Vietnam from the communists by military means. So, like you said, there are people who are still refighting the war. They can't accept that, you know, they had lost to the communists because it's such a difficult thing to accept that they lost their country. So, can you address that a little further about the division within the Vietnamese community politically, you know, religiously too? There are Catholics, there's Buddhists. It's a very complex situation, isn't it?
Yeah, and that story is called War Years. It's the only autobiographical short story I've ever written. It's about a little boy growing up in San Jose, California, where I grew up, and his parents own a Vietnamese grocery store, which my parents did. And half the story is autobiographical. And my mother told me an anecdote about someone who came to her store asking for money for this cause to go back to Vietnam and liberate the country. And I grew up aware of that because in San Jose during the 80s, you know, at the debt celebrations, the veterans would come out in their military uniforms, and there was a display at these debt celebrations showing men in uniforms in a jungle somewhere. And the point was there's a guerrilla movement out there trying to take the country back. Yeah. I never forgot that, and that became part of the basis for the sympathizer. And so I took that anecdote that my mother told me and put it into the story, and then I wrote the other half of the story that's purely fictional. But I grew up, you know, feeling that the community was actually not divided. The community was totally unified around this anti-communist cause. And in fact, it was basically the religion of the community, you know, the secular religion, that we are deeply anti-communist and we're going to take our country back. Now, what has happened in the last few decades, of course, is that part of the community has hung on to that anti-communism very, very strongly, for example, in Little Saigon, but also in San Jose. And yet at the same time, the community has changed so that there's more and more younger people who are not as invested in anti-communism. We have more and more people coming directly from Vietnam to this country as immigrants and as international students who are not necessarily as fervently anti-communist. And these divisions, and we have people who go back to Vietnam to start businesses and who are very pragmatic about their relationship to the country. So what this means, I think, is that the community is very diverse, but the public tenor is still anti-communist. And that has led to changes and to tensions and to eruptions. And so periodically, every now and then, there will be like a big anti-communist protest in San Jose or in Little Saigon, and outsiders will just scratch their heads and like, why? What's happening? And I'm an insider, and sometimes I scratch my head. I'm like, what's happening? But the last big anti-communist issue in San Jose was about whether to name the Vietnamese American business district Little Saigon or Vietnam Town. I think that was the debate. And people went crazy over this issue. Yeah. If you picked one name or the other, and I don't know which one was which, you were a communist. I was like, why? But people were really invested in that. And so this is still the politics of the communities themselves, especially in California.
Yes, and you mentioned earlier that not every refugee who came here became a model immigrant. I was in Little Saigon last week, and I was surprised to see homeless people, beggars, homeless people. We talk about the need to move on. Another need is to assimilate to American culture. It's practically an economic necessity. You have to learn the language, you have to learn the way of doing things, the way of thinking, the new culture. And yet that leads to the question of identity. Who am I? How much am I American? How much am I still Vietnamese? Did your parents go through this phase of, assimilating and trying to hang on to Vietnamese values, Vietnamese traditions? So outside of the home, they're Americans, but inside they're still Vietnamese.
Well, we were very Vietnamese, and it was really interesting because when I was growing up, my parents would always tell me, "You are 100% Vietnamese," which made me wonder. We're from North Vietnam. Maybe we have some Chinese in us. I'm not sure. Why are we protesting so vigorously this idea? So you're 100% Vietnamese. Okay, fine. And then they become citizens. They become citizens, and they change their names. I'm like, what happened here? And then they asked me, "Do you want to change your name?" And I thought about it, and I went through various names in my head, and I thought, Troy. That's the one name I remember. You laugh, it's ridiculous. And I grew up as an American, right? I totally grew up as an American, and yet I could not bring myself to change my name when I had the opportunity to do so. And I bring this up because it just shows that this question of identity or assimilation is very fluid and very conflicted for a lot of people. So my parents, they took the earliest opportunity in the early 1990s when relations were reestablished to go back to Vietnam. They went twice. And then the second time they came back, and over Thanksgiving, my dad said, "We're Americans now." So it's different, right? But I grew up very conflicted about this because, as I've said, I was an American in my parents' Vietnamese household, but outside in the rest of the country, I was a Vietnamese. Mm-hmm. And I still meet people today, so many young people who tell me I feel conflicted. Vietnamese Americans, but also Asian Americans or other people from mixed backgrounds. I still feel conflicted. I feel torn in two. I feel culturally conflicted. And I feel so bad for them because I feel like nothing has changed. We think things have changed, and yet people are still experiencing this sense of cultural division. And I want to tell them that this is not a problem. This is not a problem. We do not solve this problem by feeling as if we have to choose. Mm-hmm. And we do not solve this problem by thinking we're the ones to blame. We solve this problem by saying, look, it's racism that's to blame. We live in a racist society that's creating these kinds of conditions where people feel this way. And we have to embrace the division. We have to embrace the contradiction. That's very hard for people to do. I mean, obviously, people want to feel whole. They don't want to feel conflicted. And if I was a happier person, I would want that too. Yeah. But I'm a writer. I want to feel conflicted. Otherwise, I have nothing to write about. So I embrace the conflict. I embrace the contradiction. But I think we all should, because it's not going to go away. As long as we live in a racist country, which we will, the contradictions will not go away. And so we have to embrace it, and we have to not think about our identities as a problem, but as an opportunity.
Yes. Well, I grew up during the colonial era in Vietnam. I went to French school where I had to speak French. But when I came home, I was part of a very traditional Vietnamese family. And, I was always comfortable with that. I could separate my two selves. I'm part French when I'm in school, but I'm completely Vietnamese when I'm home. So, I kind of grew up feeling that way.
Do you think that was possible because Vietnam was still your country? I mean,
yes,
in Vietnam, you were Vietnamese.
Yes, and everybody around me was Vietnamese, and I was still immersed in Vietnamese culture.
Then when you came here, did you have a conflict? Did you have any kind of sense of division or tension or anything like that?
No, but I felt disoriented at first, and that's another issue I want to talk to you about, is the sense of dislocation. When you first arrived in a foreign country, dealing with a foreign culture, a different language. I had learned English from a French teacher who taught me the British accent, French-British combined. So so it was disoriented. I felt disoriented. And I remember that when my family fled here, my father was completely disoriented. He could speak French, but he couldn't speak English, and he couldn't wait to get to Paris. So did your parents go through that sense of dislocation too?
Well, I think it's interesting that the generational difference. I think if you come as an adult,
Yeah.
you already have your identity. You know exactly who you are. You're Vietnamese, for example, right? And so when you come here and people treat you like a foreigner, you're like, well, I am a foreigner. That's the way it is.
Yeah.
And so there is disorientation because your entire world has shifted, and all the privileges that you had as a Vietnamese person in Vietnam have vanished
Yes.
here in this country, and that's enormously painful and all of that. But that's a different experience than the younger generation that was raised here or born here. We don't necessarily feel disorientation. We feel division. We feel conflict because, again, we grow up feeling like we're American, but we live in a society that tells us we're not American. Or at least I was feeling like I was getting this signal from American society. So that when I look at my parents, well, first of all, I would have to talk to my parents to know for sure whether they have a sense of dislocation. But for me, it always seemed as if they were not dislocated. But maybe they were dislocated, and the way that they dealt with it was to affirm very strongly who they were, especially to me and to the family. So my parents are Vietnamese Catholics. And if you know anything about Catholics, you know they're very hierarchical and very devout. And if you know anything about Vietnamese people, you know we're very hierarchical and very devout. And then you cross the two with Vietnamese Catholics, and you got super devout, super hierarchical people who know exactly who they are and are willing to be martyrs for the cause. That's our role in Vietnam. You know, we feel persecuted,
Yes.
and we're willing to be sacrificed and to sacrifice ourselves. And so I think probably they did feel intense disorientation, but their response to that was, we got to work harder.
Yeah.
We have to suffer more. We have to sacrifice more. And so that was their response. Their response was to work 12 to 14 hours a day to overcome this disorientation, to make sure that they would never be disoriented again. That was their response. You know, that was what I absorbed growing up. And that really screwed me up. But anyway, that's another issue. But you know, again, I'm thankful for it because it made me a writer.
Exactly. Writers like these conflicts and these questions about your identity and doubts and so on. So, talking about assimilation, it's the children of the refugees who assimilate the most readily. In one of your stories, and I think maybe it's based on your own experience growing up, you said it's in war years. A young boy loves going to school in the story because it is like being on vacation from home. And at 3 o'clock, I was always a little disappointed to walk the 4 blocks to the grocery store my parents owned, where English was hardly ever spoken and Vietnamese was loud. And the kid in the story read Edgar Allan Poe's The Fall of the House Usher and was captivated by Captain America comics. And this assimilation can lead to kind of alienation between the two generations. And can you talk about that issue of assimilation of the younger generation and alienation from their parents who were not as attuned to American culture?
Well, all that stuff you read is completely autobiographical. You know, it's like,
Okay, so it was you.
It was me. And it was completely autobiographical. And that grocery store, the New Saigon Mini Market that my parents started, I mean, that saved our lives. You know, that's because that was how we got ahead in this country. But in order to save our lives for that market, my parents almost had to sacrifice themselves at that store, and it's a typical refugee and immigrant story. You know, this is what you got to do, and so I you know, I even now it's painful for me to talk about because that store was where I had to go, and you know, sometimes I had to work there afterwards, and I could see how much my parents suffered working there and getting shot in that store and all these kinds of things, and so I didn't want to be there. I did not want to be in that store. And my parents, bless them, did not want me to be there too. They tried to save me from that as much as possible. but they were oriented purely towards survival and towards for them survival meant work and religion, and survival meant survival for our family, but also survival for the Vietnamese relatives that we left behind. So a lot of that, much of what they suffered was in order to make money enough to send back to the people in Vietnam, because we had left almost everybody behind, and they were starving. The 80s were a bad time in Vietnam. So I knew all of that. I was very conscious of all of that. I was very conscious of the fact that my parents would be boxing up these fancy boombox stereos in order to ship them back to Vietnam so the relatives could sell them to live, And for me, assimilation meant getting the hell out of that store, getting out of San Jose, because I just associated San Jose with suffering, especially for the Vietnamese community, and I didn't want anything to do with it. And so what I had to do was, in college, get over this binary of either I'm going to be in the store or I'm going to be out of the store. I'm going to be in the Vietnamese community or I'm going to be out of the Vietnamese community. Because if you accept that binary, you lose. Because it means what? You have to leave behind your community, you have to leave behind your parents and stuff. No, I had to, for me, it was what saved my life was going to Berkeley. Because going to Berkeley was like getting hit by intellectual lightning. And all of a sudden, I was electrified. I took Asian American Studies classes there, and I was like, what are you telling me? That there was the Chinese Exclusion Act? That there was Japanese American internment? That there wasn't just the Vietnam War, there was the Korean American War and the Philippine American War, and all of a sudden, I had the history that allowed me to make sense out of my parents' store and out of the Vietnam War. And I spent, I wrote several theses on the Vietnam War. I wrote a thesis on Edward Said, on Edward Said and Graham Greene and the Quiet American. That taught me a lot and would feed into the Sympathizer. I wrote a whole thesis on Vietnamese women's writing. Okay, so I was desperately trying to make sense out of my life intellectually and politically so that I wouldn't be forced to choose, that I wouldn't feel that assimilation meant leaving my parents behind. No, my goal was to forge an identity for myself that wasn't about assimilation, but was something more militant, about being Asian American, so that I could fuse all these things together. And that was the journey that would eventually lead me to writing The Refugees and The Sympathizer, that I wanted to redefine this history on my terms, and to talk about American culture and Vietnamese culture and history on my terms, and not on the terms of assimilation, which was, I think, the signal that was being sent to me as a young boy growing up in San Jose. Either be Vietnamese or be American, but you can't be both. And my project was to struggle against that and to say, I'm going to redefine all this so that I can talk about American history and Vietnamese history the way I want to.
You talk about discovering the other side of America. I remember when I grew up in Saigon, I watched a lot of Hollywood movies like Picture America as this paradise and so on. And then when I came to America, I went to Georgetown. And my first trip to the South, just across the bridge into Virginia, I discovered another America, segregation.
What year was this?
1960. So it was still, America was still very segregated, whites only, bathrooms, restaurants, and so on. So
I just think that's like a forgotten history, because, for example, my father-in-law was a paratrooper, and he was in Fort Benning in the 1950s, and so he saw some of this stuff going on as well. And there are all these Vietnamese people here before 1975 who were here for military reasons and for studying and for diplomacy and all that. And we sort of don't know as much about what that time was like. I'm very, deeply curious about that, because we only talk about Vietnamese Americans after 75, and that you're part of a generation that saw a completely different world.
Yeah. So the sense of alienation, you actually talk about it in one of your story. It's the father who was developing Alzheimer, and the couple, he and his wife, have 6 children, and yet they never came to visit them except for one. But this one who comes to visit very rarely spends more time working out in the gym and then coming to see his parents. So assimilation can lead to dilution of family bonds, family values, because in Vietnam, the family is everything. It's the center of your universe. And yet in this story, this couple is practically abandoned by their children.
And it's absolutely true what you're saying. Obviously, that family is fundamental, and the dream is that 3 generations will live under one roof and all of that. And I certainly know families like that, and I know close-knit Vietnamese families and all of that. But I've also known and seen and heard of Vietnamese families that are totally fractured, either by the trauma of the war or by assimilation or because people just did bad things, abandoned their families, for example, had wives in Vietnam and wives here in the United States. All this is part of, Vietnamese American lore and all that. And so in writing The Refugees, what was important for me was not to treat the Vietnamese refugee community or Vietnamese American community as if it was homogenous, as if we could all be defined by certain kinds of cultural ideas like, oh yes, all Vietnamese people are filial. Well, I mean, Vietnamese culture is filial, but there are plenty of non-filial Vietnamese people, yes, for example.
Exactly.
And so what I wanted to do in this book was to say, yes, we're Vietnamese, we have this thing in common, but if you say someone is Vietnamese, it means no more than to say that someone is American. You look at American literature, you don't expect American literature to say only one thing about one population. You expect a vast diversity of voices and experiences, and that's what I wanted to do in The Refugees, is to say, look, there are so many different kinds of people, so many different kinds of experiences. They extend from loving families to families that are not so loving and that have been fractured and forced apart by history and by assimilation.
So another theme you discuss is the expectations or excessive expectations. In one story, the expectation not only from the parents toward the children, but also relatives in Vietnam toward relatives who've made it to America, the land of plenty, the street is paved with gold, and relatives in Vietnam expect those who've made it here to be very successful. And Vietnamese here at the beginning when they first came, and those in Vietnam used to think that to be successful, children have to be doctors or lawyers or dentists, engineers. So in one story, this woman, Vivian, Vietnamese American, goes back to Saigon, and her family has cultivated this aura of success and passing her off as a doctor. So when she goes back to Vietnam, she impresses her relatives with her high spending habits and so on and so forth. But in the end, it becomes apparent that it's all a sham. And her cousin, who has idolized her as a successful doctor in Chicago, I guess, realizes that it's all a fraud. So she burns the photos and so on because she's so disappointed. And so my question is, did your parents have expectations of you? And when you decided to become a writer, did they say, learn computer science?
Well, when I was growing up in San Jose as a kid and as a teenager and feeling very alienated and everything, I didn't realize at the time that what I needed were more voices, more stories about people like us, people like me, but they weren't out there, and there weren't enough out there. And if they were out there, I didn't know that they existed. And I'm looking back, I can certainly think, well, yes, the reason we have this paucity of voices, whether they're Vietnamese or Asian Americans, is partly because of racism, right? But it's also partly because of Asian parents, okay? Asian parents out there, you got to do better, We can't just say you have to be doctors or lawyers or engineers. We have to acknowledge that we need our writers and our artists and so many other different kinds of people. But I'm just going to talk about that. Without our stories, what are we? We're not going to be a part of this country without our stories. We're not going to be a part of Vietnam if that's what we're concerned about without our stories too. So that's one of the reasons why I wanted to become a writer, because I knew the importance of storytelling. And I was lucky, relatively, that my parents, who were so conservative in almost every aspect of their lives, somehow turned out to be kind of liberal in this respect, And I think what happened is that my brother went to college and he became a doctor. Okay, so that helped. But
He also went to Harvard.
He went to Harvard. God, I was like, oh my, I'm never going to live this down. I went to my last choice college, okay, but my brother went to Harvard. 7 years after he comes to this country with no English, he goes to Harvard. So it's an impossible standard. And but he was also a philosophy major. So he did the other thing that you can do, which is to work twice as hard. It's like, okay, so you're going to be philosophy and pre-med. So when I went to college, he said, look, okay, you can be an English major. Just tell mom and dad you're pre-med too. So I did. And I was actually pre-med. I went to UC Riverside my freshman year, and I was in honors chemistry, for example, for 11 weeks. 11 weeks. I know it was a quarter system. I made it past one quarter in the first week, and I ended the first quarter with a B+, which is not bad. I mean, it's like an F for Asians, but nevertheless, not bad. Not bad. And the reason I got it was because of partial credit. And I was like, I understood nothing in this course, and I still got a B+. God, help my patience if I become a doctor at some point. But the 11th week, I was sitting in honors chemistry, and I just thought, enough of this. I quit. I walked out. I never came back. And then I told my parents, I'm going to be pre-law. And that held them off for a few years. And then, but in the back of my mind, I really loved English, But I thought, I love studying the Romantic poets. But there's no way I could go back to my parents who were working 12 to 14-hour days in a grocery store and say, Mom and Dad, I really want to study the Romantic poets. And so what changed for me was I also became an ethnic studies major. I read Chicano literature and Asian American literature and African American literature, and I thought, this matters. This stuff matters. Stories are not just frivolous. They allow us to change our world and to imagine new possibilities. And so I told my parents, I'm going to become a doctor of English. So I thought, when I said doctor, like, oh, they sat up and said English. I'm like, what? And so bless them, they just said, okay, fine, do it. But your brother finished his doctorate in 4 years. How long is it going to take you? So I finished in 5. Because I had to get a job, So that was the saving grace. It's like, okay, I'll become a doctor of English, but I'm going to get a job as a professor. And so they never asked me what I did. They just said, fine, you have a job as a professor. We don't have to worry about you anymore. But I never told them I was going to become a writer. That would just go way too far. So I did that in secret. But I think the point is that we need more than doctors and lawyers and engineers. We need them too, of course. But those are noble professions. But so is being a writer and a scholar. And in Vietnam, these are noble. At least being a scholar is a noble profession, right? Yes. But I think, because of capitalism in Vietnam, it no longer is. And because of capitalism here and because of what this country is, we don't respect our scholars here. Mm-hmm. And so Vietnamese culture has totally changed here in the United States, but in Vietnam as well. Mm-hmm. And I think that's just so sad that we no longer respect our scholars and our writers.
Well, the loss of science, medicine, and law is our gain because you become a great writer. So,
but you have to win the Pulitzer Prize. That's just not fair. I want to say you can become a writer and be a failure, and it's okay. You don't have to become a writer and win the Pulitzer Prize. Although that made everything better with my parents. It's totally true.
So I have a friend whose son majored in history, and she was so disappointed. And the son eventually earned a PhD and taught history at Cornell, an Ivy League school. And the mother was still, every time I saw her, she shook her head. She was so disappointed. But you're right, Asian parents can be a real pain. Mm-hmm. Okay, how much time do we have? Okay, let's see, what else can I ask you? There's so many questions. Your story, you paint such a large canvas. You captures the immigrant from a Hispanic immigrant, but you also talk, in one story, you talk about the feeling of guilt between 2 generations of Americans, the father who was a B-52 pilot dropping bombs in Vietnam, and the daughter who feels a sense of guilt over what her father has done and becomes, in a sense, a refugee herself because she moves to Vietnam and works to help demine the mines that's still maiming and killing Vietnamese. So can you talk about this sense of guilt that pervades not just Vietnamese Americans, but also for maybe losing the country, but it also, the sense of guilt among different generations of Americans?
So that story is called The Americans, and the bomber pilot is actually, an African-American bomber pilot. And, part of what I wanted to do in the refugees was not only talk about Vietnamese people, because it's not as if Vietnamese people only hang around Vietnamese people all the time. We do know other folks. So the collection actually has other characters who are not Vietnamese, and this is one of them. And I wanted to write that story partly because I wanted to talk about people who are not Vietnamese, and which would mean not just talking about white people, but talking about other kinds of Americans. So there's one story about a Latino character in Orange County, there's another story about this black bomber pilot. And I wanted to talk about guilt and trauma, and I didn't want to talk about the usual thing, which is, to talk about the American foot soldier in Vietnam, and we've all seen these stories and heard these stories and so on. And very important stories, but I wanted to talk about a different kind of experience, which is obviously that all kinds of bombs were dropped on Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, and so on. And the bomber pilots who did this didn't necessarily feel guilty about doing that. Right? Because they never saw what they were doing. And that to me is a very American experience. We like to drop bombs on people, that's who we are. And it doesn't necessarily make us feel guilty as a country. That to me was interesting. Like, how do you, as I am deeply opposed to bombing, okay? But it would not be a very interesting story if I just wrote a story where I just said, this is terrible. I wanted to try to get inside this pilot's psychology and think about how would he deal with this? How would he feel about this? And to confront responsibility and to confront how someone deals with the past when he can't even articulate it to himself. He never admits to himself his guilt or his culpability. He resists that. And he thinks his daughter has become this crazy liberal for bringing this up. And so that was what I wanted to deal with, the very common mindset that we are not responsible, that what we have done is not wrong, and to try to understand how someone would live their life in that way.
Mm-hmm. So, okay.
Can we take questions from the audience? Is it after that? Okay, all right.
My last question has to do with what advice would you give to people who want to become writers? In one of your interviews,
Don't do it.
in one of the interviews online that I checked, you said that you started writing short stories, but your agent told you that there's no money to be made writing short stories and advised you to write a full-length novel. Would you still advise people to start out small and write short stories before, writing a full-length novel, or do whatever inspires you?
I think you should do whatever inspires you, but if you don't have to be a writer, I'm serious, don't do it. It's like it's not a fun job, I mean, it's a job that requires a lot of endurance and discipline and solitude and suffering. And if you enjoy all those things, then do it. I think the writers I know feel compelled to do it. The people who don't feel compelled to do it eventually give up. And that's a good thing. Because my accountant at one point asked me, for tax purposes, how long do you think you've spent writing? Okay, there's a complicated formula for how he's going to do this. So I sat there, I sort of did averages, I looked over the past 20 years, and I think I probably spent about, at least on fiction, about 10,000 hours, as Malcolm Gladwell says you got to do. And he thinks he's kind of sort of right. And so 10,000 hours, okay, if that's one thing if you're in the Northeast and it's freezing and cold and you want to spend time indoors, but I'm in California. I spent 10,000 hours in a room, and most of those 10,000 hours I was just looking at a blank white wall. And that's what it means to be a writer. To just sit by yourself for that long and to go into yourself, because that's the only resource that you have. I mean, yes, you can go to the library, you can go to the archives, you can go into the field, all that is important too. But most of the time it's spent looking inside yourself. And you have to be very comfortable doing that. And as one of my teachers told me in college, writing teachers, she had read one of my short stories and thought it was terrible. And she said, you don't cut close enough to the bone. And I thought, how do I do that? It's like, if it's just a matter of physically cutting yourself, not a problem. But for writers, it's like looking inside of yourself and going into the places where it hurts, which most sensible people don't want to do. But as a writer, that's your resource. The pain that you feel is the pain that you have to tap into in order to give that pain to your characters, or whatever feeling that your characters have to have. You have to find it within inside yourself. And I think that is half of what it takes to be a writer. The other half is the technical stuff. The technical stuff. How do you write a story? How do you craft a scene? How do you plot a novel? You know, that's important too. And books and classes can teach you that. But books and classes and teachers can't teach you how to go inside of yourself. So I took some classes, but mostly it was me teaching myself over the course of 20 years. That's how long it took me to become a writer. I came to Southern California in '97 with my PhD. I was going to start teaching at USC in August, and I came to LA in May or something. And I thought, I have the summer, so I'm going to write a short story collection. Should be easy. They're just short stories. Well, it took me 20 years to publish that short story collection. That's how long it took me to become a writer. And it was because I faced myself and endured all those rejections and all that solitude that I became a writer. And how you do it is your own individual path. Some of you would take longer, some of you would take shorter. Some of you would choose to write poetry, some of you would choose to write short fiction, some of you would choose to write novels or memoirs or nonfiction. It doesn't really matter what path you choose. They're all equally hard. You know, just because something is shorter doesn't mean it's easier. I started off writing poetry. I thought, poetry. You know, and poetry was harder than writing short stories. So I stopped being a poet. Then I wrote short stories. I started off writing short stories because I thought they're short. They must be easier than writing a novel. I'll train myself by writing short stories. It took me 20 years. And then ironically, when it came time to writing The Sympathizer, because my agent told me to, it only took 2 years. Because by that time I had spent 17 years banging my head against the wall writing short stories, and I had actually learned something, and I was able to make that breakthrough. And I wish for all of you who want to be writers that you'll reach that moment of breakthrough. But in order to break through, you have to work enormously hard to do it at the same time.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Time for questions. And we have people with microphones. If you'll come down and
So maybe we can take a question from here in the second row. This gentleman in the sweatshirt.
Oh.
Hi. Before you were published, how did you face the sort of doubts about your own work, especially since it's so important to you? Like, how did you face the doubt that people would want to read and that it would be published?
Well, I think that's part of the definition of the difficulty of being a writer is this anxiety about, number one, am I good enough? All writers deal with that. And then number two, will I get published? Will anybody else care? And I think there was no way to deal with it except just to have faith that it was going to be worth it. And to feel like I had no choice. Like I was just stubborn. So even with all the rejections, I was still stubborn. Even when I got a success, for example, getting a short story published, I would realize no one cared. No one cared when I didn't get a short story published, and no one cared when I did get a short story published. No one cared. You know, no one read it before it got published, and then after it got published, maybe 10 people read it. And so what I'm trying to say is that every writer has to go through this ordeal to build self-confidence and have faith in her or his own capacity and her or his own vision. I had to believe that what I had to say was worthwhile. And we all have to find that strength within ourselves to do that. And that was how I became a writer, to endure it long enough so that at a certain point it was no longer important to me whether anybody else read my work. I think I, like many other aspiring writers, wanted approval from agents and editors and publishers and ultimately readers, but that's the wrong approval. You know, of course it's nice to get that and we won't get published without that. But in the end, I reached a certain point after about 17 years and I had published some stories where I thought, I don't care anymore whether anybody else likes my work. I'm going to write for me. And that was the breakthrough. And that was the moment of liberation. And I've heard that from so many writers, that was what was really crucial, is to finally dispel from your shoulder this anxiety about having someone else read and care about it, and to ultimately understand that you had to please yourself first that you are the first audience, and every writer has to get to that point. You have a microphone too, right? So maybe someone over there?
Thank you both very much. We have for about 3 years have a refugee resettlement group here called the Newcomers Access Center in the Inland Empire. What would you say, maybe each of you can answer, to the many volunteers? What's the best thing the volunteers can do to help folks?
Let me think. The reason I'm hesitating is that my family came here and, they got sponsored, they got out, and they got jobs, and, menial jobs like you talk about at first. So I would say that probably the best thing would be to understand what that person has gone through, and then finds out what needs this person has, not just material needs, jobs and so on, but psychological needs, and then just the basic things to help this person get on his or her feet: English language training in American culture, how do you go about doing things like that. I think that would be very helpful, and of course, maintaining the hope, that life will get better, if not for them, then for their children. I think hope is something very important to keep a person who has lost everything to keep going. I remember from my family, that was the one thing that kept us going. Every time we lost everything, it was the hope that things would work out in the end that kept us going. Can you add to that?
I mean, besides all of that, which is all obviously very important, I think of the work that people do with refugees now, with the work that people did with us as refugees 40, 50 years ago. And I think that those people who helped us back then had no idea what was going to happen in the future. And neither did we, right? And yet, 40 or 50 years later, what's happened with the Vietnamese refugee community is that even with all the ups and downs and the unevenness, some people have succeeded, some people have not, the community has become firmly established here. It's a success story in that sense, not because we became doctors and lawyers or engineers, but because we formed a community here, and we have supported and nurtured each other. And I think that people who helped us out 40 or 50 years ago must look at that and feel that they've done the work. Their work was so crucial, but they would not have known that for so long. And so I think that's what's happening now for people who are helping refugees now, is to understand that it's going to pay off. It's just going to pay off 10 or 20 or 30 years down the road. It's the same kind of work that we do as teachers. We teach and we think we'll never know what happens to our students, or that if we do know, it won't be for another 10 or 20 or 30 years when someone comes back and says something to us. That's what's going to happen with refugees as well.
At the end of your book, you had some papers included that you'd written. One of them about refugees and how perhaps the Vietnamese refugees differ from other refugees, perhaps maybe because of guilt on the part of America and sympathy for refugees when the Vietnamese came, but how differently they're treated now from, let's say, the ones from Latin America, and how it's a radically different culture now you're facing. Do you want to explore that further?
So the instigation for that was that we are now living in a refugee world. There are refugee waves coming at the United States, coming at Europe. People feel there's a sense of crisis. Obviously the refugees feel they're in crisis, but Europeans and Americans feel that they're in a crisis too. And there's a huge debate about whether to take in refugees or not, or how many numbers and so on. And the instigation for me was that there were some former Vietnamese refugees who were saying, no, we shouldn't take in any more refugees. Because we Vietnamese refugees were the good refugees. And these new refugees are the bad refugees, because they're Latin Americans, for example, or they're Muslim and so on. And I grew up in this Vietnamese refugee community of the 1980s in San Jose, and let me tell you, there were a lot of bad Vietnamese refugees. did a lot of bad things. And so the very language of good and bad is irrelevant. You know, it's just a moralistic language that people accept. And we should dispose of that language of good or bad refugees. But more to the point, for the Vietnamese refugees who are saying this, they don't understand that we were not the good refugees. We were the lucky refugees, because it was to the advantage of the United States to take in refugees fleeing from a newly communist country as evidence of how great the United States and capitalism were. Now the circumstances have changed, because now there is no benefit for the United States to say, hey, we're going to take in refugees from Latin America, for example, or from dominantly Islamic countries. And so there's less sympathy for these refugees, and there's less guilt on the part of Americans, because Americans don't see their relationship to what is going on either in the Middle East or Latin America. Americans can see a very direct responsibility to what happened in Southeast Asia, right, for obvious reasons, but they don't see it with what's happening now, even though we do have a hand in the Middle East and we do have a hand in Latin America. And so there's so much more work that needs to be done for those of us who are advocates for refugees to say, look, we have to tell the story, we have to narrate this situation so that Americans can see their responsibility. We would hope that we would feel human responsibility just generally, but we have historical responsibility to these countries and to these people who are coming. And so that's what I wanted to try to do with that article from the back of the book and from other things that I'm writing as well.
Thank you both for teaching us, and this is really like a master class in humanity, so thank you. And thank you for all the teachers that are in the room. I know there are many. Want to take it a slightly different direction. You mentioned your son. Sounds like he's about 5 or 6. What are you looking forward to reading to him down the line? What are books that you think will really help him navigate his life?
You know, it's really interesting being a father of a son, because I haven't read children's literature since I was a child. And now I'm reading all kinds of children's literature and realizing things have changed for the better, you know? Because I've given my son, for example, I loved Curious George when I was growing up, so I gave him Curious George, but it's clear, Curious George is a colonizer's book, right? Okay, so yes, he loves Curious George too, but I'm so thankful he has other options out there that are, you know, written by artists like of our generation, for example, who have grown up in a multicultural era, in a decolonizing era, where we don't have to turn to some of these kinds of images. So actually, I'm actually learning from what he's choosing, you know. Like, hey, Dog Man is an awesome book, okay? A Dog Man, and so I think that it's what. I mean, I want to read him. I want to read him stuff, you know, that I think is important. But I'm also trying to learn from what he's being exposed to as well. And I'm also trying to walk the walk when it comes to being that Asian parent. You know, yes, I'm forcing him to take piano lessons, for example. I'm sending him to French school.
Mea culpa.
But we also worked on a book together. So I took him to an artist residency last year. I had to be there. And then he met one of his favorite children's book authors and illustrators, T. Bui and Bao Phi. And he was so inspired that he went and he wrote his own comic book, his own story. And then I posted it online on Facebook. And an editor said, "Is that a real book?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Can we publish it?" I said, "Yes." And so, you know, I took his story, because it's a crazy story. I could never have imagined it myself. I put a narration on it. And then T. Bui and her 12-year-old son, Hien, are illustrating it. And so that's what to me is actually crucial. He's going to he's written his own book. And I went to his kindergarten class yesterday and I presented that book. I was very terrified. I was like, okay, I got to impress these 5-year-olds, you know. and they laughed, thankfully. They enjoyed the book. So yes, that's the answer to the question. We got to read to our children, but we also have to encourage them to become writers and artists, and even if they're not doing that in terms of ever becoming professionals, they need to tell their own stories. And I think that's just as important as reading books to them, but I do read to him every day as well.
All right, so first off, thank you so much to you both for coming here. It's really refreshing to be able to have this perspective, especially here at the colleges. I've just recently finished reading The Sympathizer, which was fantastic, by the way. And I was really struck by the different perspectives and the different types of criticism that you have for kind of everyone across the board, from communist, anti-communist, Vietnamese Americans to Vietnamese residing in Vietnam. So with that being said, I think I have a two-pronged question. The first is, what led you to go in that direction within the story? And then second of all, what has been the reception that you've received by Vietnamese Americans, and especially Vietnamese residing in Vietnam, with these stories that you've told about them?
Well, I just emailed my publisher in Vietnam, and I said, "What's happening with the sympathizer?" And she said, "Well, the translation was done like last year." She says, "We're just trying to find some publishing company that will give us permission to publish it." And I said, "It's politics, right?" She said, "No, I think it's just we're having problems." I'm like, "It's politics, it's politics," because what happened with the sympathizer was that I wanted to fully confront what I thought of as the tragedy of Vietnamese history, which is that every side lost something. Every side believed that they were doing the right thing. Everybody believed they were doing the right thing. And every side lost something in this war. And I wasn't interested in picking sides. I grew up in this refugee community where we were forced to pick a side. Like, you are either with us or against us. We're the victims, we're the good people, the communists are evil, And I didn't see the world in that way. And I grew up reading a lot about the Vietnam War because I was fascinated by it, because I knew it had shaped me. And my ethical problem when I was growing up was imagining, what would I have done if I lived during that time period? I can make all kinds of judgments about people, but what would I have done if I had been there? And that was the impetus for writing The Sympathizer, was not to make judgments on people, but to try to imagine what it would mean where everybody lost in this conflict. And so I wanted to create a character who would be right in the middle of history and right in the middle of all these conflicted choices. So I made him a spy. I made him a communist who was deeply in doubt eventually about communism. And what that meant was that I wrote a book that didn't please anybody, okay? So the Vietnamese community here in the United States, the Vietnamese people, the Vietnamese government in Vietnam, I think probably has problems with the book because it's about a communist who has doubts about communism and shows that the Communist Party did something right and then did something horrible in the years after the war. And then the Vietnamese community here in the United States, there are so many people, I think, who refuse to read the book because it's written from the perspective of a communist spy, and they want nothing to do with communists. It's simply not possible for them. And then there are Americans who read this book, and they write me hate mail and say, you hate this country so much, why don't you just go back to Vietnam and take your son with you? Mm-hmm. And so that was the book I wanted to write. I wanted to write a book that offended everybody. because I had not seen that book yet. Every account that I had seen of the Vietnam War, almost every account chose a side and chose to tell the war from one perspective. And it was so deeply, some of these books were very powerful, but at the same time also unsatisfying to me. And again, that is a very common experience for a writer. We're unsatisfied with what we've read, and therefore feel like we have to write the book that we need to see. And so that was the genesis of The Sympathizer.
First, thank you so much for being here. I think it means a lot as a second-generation Vietnamese American. For both of you being part of really big projects the last few years with talks in the Vietnamese community, how have you been able to use your experience with those projects to talk about the Vietnamese American experience with your families, with friends, and with people who are not as familiar with the trauma and the Vietnamese American experience?
Maybe you want.
The question is,
How have you used your platform, I guess that's the language, to talk about Vietnamese and Vietnamese Americans to an American audience now that you've had the opportunity with the Ken Burns documentary and after Sacred Willow?
yeah, well, I'm sort of in the same boat you are because I stand kind of in the middle of this conflict that is still dividing the Vietnamese community. Some people like it, some people hate it. Like you, I've offended both sides. The communists like some part of it, they hate other parts of it. So when I talk to the Vietnamese students that I met, for example, at Irvine, I try to tell them to look at this objectively, because the history is extremely complex, and like you said, there are good guys and bad guys on both sides. And I think it's very crucial to approach this with an open mind, and don't approach the history, the recent history, with preconceived notion as to which side did the right thing or the wrong thing, because they did wrong things and good things. And that was my advice to the Vietnamese Americans who came up to see me, because when Ken Burns went on this promotion tour, he didn't have time to show 10 episodes, 18 hours long, so he only showed clips. And I would tell them, just watch the whole thing with an open mind and come to your own conclusions at the end. Because the film, like Ken said, Ken said, he doesn't want to put his thumb on the scale of history. He doesn't want to take side. So he tries to be as objective as possible and presents the viewpoints of all sides in this very divisive conflict. So that was my advice to them, is to, I don't want them to make up their minds beforehand, and just watch it and make their own conclusions, and maybe talk to their parents and find out what happened from their perspective, because there's just so many perspectives when you look at this war.
Well, I think my answer is twofold. I think that on the one hand, I've besides writing the books, and I've published 3 books in the last 3 years or 4 years, dealing with the Vietnam War in various angles. Besides that, and I've written a bunch of op-eds and magazine articles and so on. And part of the effort there is to say, that the history of the Vietnam War in this country has been defined mostly by Americans. And it's ironic, obviously, because it was mostly Southeast Asians. I mean, if you just want to look at it quantitatively by any kind of metric, it was like mostly Southeast Asians who paid the price in this war, and yet here in this country, we are oriented towards the American perspective, which is fine. It's the United States, except for the fact that we're not even allowed to speak on our own history. There are still events that happen where it's like, oh, this is a conference on the Vietnam War, and everybody here will be a white guy. I'm like, come on, what's the problem here? And so I've tried to be as assertive as possible in public and say, no, I mean, we have a voice in this because it's our history, and in that sense, both to say something, but also to model something for this generation of Vietnamese and Asian Americans, that we have to be assertive about our perspective. We can't just be doctors and lawyers and engineers, although that's all very important. We have to also have our artists and our writers and our speakers and our activists and our politicians and people who will take a public stance and a public role to transform the debate in this country, so that we're at the center of the issues that concern us. And the issues that concern us are, yes, the Vietnam War, but it's just not the Vietnam War either. I mean, part of the dilemma of being a minority in this country is that we're given, and this is the words of the poet Bao Phi, we're given one grief. One grief. That's all you get, he says. Okay, he's ventriloquizing what power says to us. I go, so you're Vietnamese? Okay, you can say something about the Vietnam War. That's all you get. And so we want to be able to redefine our history of Vietnam and the Vietnam War, but we can't only be allowed to speak on that issue. So we have to be assertive and also say, look, we have so many other things that we can talk about as well. And so that's also what I've been trying to say in the op-eds and the magazine articles. That cover article for Time magazine was exactly about that. It's not just about Vietnam. It's about the entire country and who we are as Americans, and that the Vietnamese are a part of the United States now. And we have a say now in this country as well.
One more question. One more.
Thanks. Thank you both for speaking today, and this question is for Professor Nguyen. There were like a couple, I guess, quote unquote, trends that I think were kind of big last year in 2018. On the one hand, you had like the rise of Asian representation in art and media, and on the other hand, you had the rise, or I guess like resurgence of socialism in politics, and just like anti-capitalist critiques in general. And at the same time that I read your book, The Sympathizer, I was also reading other books like Severance by Ling Ma, who's Chinese American, and Dear Cyborgs by Eugene Lim, who's Korean American. And those books also have like very subtle but super sharply observed critiques of capitalism, like fully at their foundation. And it's interesting because I think that in Asian American communities, especially those that have been like affected by or have complicated relationships with communism, there is this reluctance to critique capitalism as loudly or as fervently as is now becoming popular, I think. And so I guess my question is, what do you see as like the future or the challenges facing Asian American writers specifically who want to look critically at capitalism and who want to like think imaginatively about other political futures and incorporate that into their work?
Yeah. No, that's a really good question, and it was always a lot on my mind, you know, because for those of you who don't know, I did my dissertation and my first book on Asian American literature, so I read a lot of it, and I was always very concerned about what the politics of the literature was and what did writers feel that they could talk about, you know. And this is also true for Vietnamese American literature as well, relatively more recent phenomenon. And I think you're absolutely right that, you know, the sway of the immigrant and refugee narrative is very strong on Asian American and Vietnamese American literature, especially for the Vietnamese. We come here as refugees or immigrants, and we feel that we should be grateful to this country. And as I've said in The Sympathizer, well, yes, we are grateful to be rescued by Americans, but perhaps we wouldn't need to be grateful if you hadn't bombed us in the first place. Okay, so it's a complicated set of emotions, and so yes, people I think have a hard time getting past the American dream part. And let me say this about the American dream: the American dream allows us to criticize America. That's a part of the American dream. That's what sets us off from communists, for example. But that's the dilemma, right? Like then you say, well, you can't criticize it too much, because if you criticize it so much, just go back to where you came from. And so then a lot of, I think, Asian American writers have backed off from more radical. There are a lot of radical critiques, but a lot of Asian American writers have also backed off from radical critique, and that's also especially true for Vietnamese American writers, this reluctance to go too far. So the American dream allows us to say things like, well, my parents were refugees and they had a horrible time working in a grocery store. Yeah, that's part of the American dream. They suffered, they struggled, and then they became Americans, right? And so we have to go beyond that narrative. And I think that actually, if you look at Asian American literature, we have that narrative. You know, people like Carlos Bulosan, for example. He's a Marxist, published Americans in the Heart in 1946, and then died in obscurity in 1956 when it became unfashionable to be communist in the United States. So we have that tradition as well. But there's no doubt that it's easier to get published if your story hews closer to the narrative of the American dream with all of its problems versus saying, you know, let's have an anti-capitalist critique. But what I think we're basically seeing in these trends that you're identifying is the fact that the long narrative of capitalist development in this country, which includes the Vietnam War as a capitalist war, or capitalist war of capitalism versus communism, the long history is that we're still in the Vietnam War era phase. You know, like capitalism was supposed to bring all these benefits to Southeast Asia and to the United States, and it's not working out that way. And so younger people, I think, who have not seen the benefits of capitalism that were seen by their parents' generation, for example, are legitimately concerned about whether capitalism can deliver on its promises. So I think we're going to see more of these kinds of critiques. I don't think we need to encourage Asian American writers, because there's less interest in simply telling the story about how the classic Asian American story about how, oh, it was awful in Asia, we came to the United States, we struggled through the immigrant experience, and now we're Americans, it's awesome. And so now we're reaching the phase of disillusionment that the younger generation or the second generation experiences. And I think it's a good thing, because it revitalizes the literature, because the tropes of the American dream and immigration, all that kind of stuff, they're tired. We need something else, and the younger writers are bringing something else. Thank you very much. And thank you. Have you signed my book?
We thank our speakers so much. Can we give them another hand? Thank you. Okay, what we'd like you to do is just to sort of stay and let them go up take their water with them, and get settled in. And then if you will go up, there are some books that are available for sale if you wish, or if you have books, and they will be there up there to sell them or to sign them for you. Sign them for you. Thank you. Thank you for coming.